Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm andGabby from the Children's Department.
We're here to do another book talking. Our subject today is vampires.
Yay!
I know, I love vampires
I know.
too. We've talked about vampires before, but
the first episode.
Yeah, our very first one.
Yeah.
But mostly we talked about like the modern incarnation of vampires.
Yes.
And the fact is, vampires go way back, like way, way back. Yeah, the field of vampire lore is huge. You can write an entire book on it. In fact, you can write this entire book on it. This is an encyclopedia of the undead. It's one of at least 3 encyclopedias of vampires that are floating around out there. Vampire lore is huge and it's ancient. The version of vampires that we have now is very different from what they were originally.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, every society recreates vampire legends for their own way of looking at the world.
Mm-hmm.
And vampire legends go back to before recorded history. Every single culture on Earth has had some version of an undead creature that comes back and drinks blood, usually blood, sometimes other things. Those myths go at least as far back as ancient Mesopotamia.
Oh wow.
Yeah. It's some of the oldest monsters in the world. In Mesopotamia, they had the Utuku, which were unclean spirits that would take over people's bodies and then they would run around and eat human flesh and drink blood and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah, nasty stuff. There was also the Lilitu, which was related to Lilith, kind of, but not exactly. It was a female demoness.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next recorded vampires that we know about, the ancient Greeks had striges.
Okay.
S-T-R-I-G-E-S, yeah.
I've heard the word before.
Well,
yeah.
slightly more famous than that, the Romans had strix.
Yeah.
Yeah, strix is a word that's still used in common, like vampire parlance today. The strixes were blood-drinking spirits.
Mm-hmm.
Oddly, they could change into owls.
Owls?
Yes. Well, owls were the only like predatory flying thing they knew of, apart from eagles that they considered too cool to be like nasty blood drinkers. But owls were creepy and mysterious, and they only came out at night.
Yeah.
So they're associated with these strixes.
Yeah, you would expect bats because that's kind of like a given.
But I realized that during my research.
Yeah.
Because the only bats that drink blood are the ones that come from South America.
Mm-hmm.
So no one in ancient Europe knew those vampires those bats existed. When you think about it, the vast majority of bats on Earth eat insects.
Yeah.
I mean, the bats we have around here in New England, they eat insects. They're really good at clearing the yard of mosquitoes.
Yeah, definitely.
They're excellent for that.
Which
And,
I applaud
yeah.
them.
Yeah, and in some more tropical countries, they have fruit bats that eat like rotten fruit from the tree and so forth. All of them relatively non-dangerous. So every country had this concept, but the idea hadn't been codified, and of course they weren't called vampires. Even in the Odyssey by Homer,
Yeah.
when Odysseus visits the underworld to summon the spirits of the dead, he sacrifices a ram. And the fresh blood draws their ghosts out of Hades to come and talk to him. Because even in those days, they associated that the dead drink blood.
Mm-hmm.
What else would they drink? In Celtic countries, you've had the Bavan-Shi. They were part of the Celtic folklore that I've been talking about in my other video series.
These names are just very creative, and I
They're
love them.
extremely creative,
I like
yeah.
them.
Yeah, Bavan-Shi, I can't even spell it without looking it up. But the last part of it is spelled S-I-D-H-E, which is pronounced she.
Yeah.
They're dimly related to the Banshee.
The Banshee, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The Bavan-Shi are slightly more mysterious version. They drank human blood. They're fairies that drank human blood.
Fairies.
Yep,
Wow.
blood-drinking fairies. In Africa, you had the Adzi,
Okay.
and they could actually transform into a ball of light that would follow along behind children and drink their blood. Mysteriously, they probably resembled fireflies a lot.
Probably.
But you never knew. It could be a firefly or it could be a blood-drinking vampire.
I can just imagine like little kids just terrified when they see it.
Yeah, I don't know why fireflies, which are really innocuous and innocent, got associated with vampires, but they did in Africa. In Malaysia, you had a vampire that I can't pronounce. The Mananagal.
Okay.
Yes, the Mananagal is an extremely strange creature. You can find information about it on the internet because they appear in a lot of like Malaysian horror movies. Basically, the Mananagal looked like a woman during the day, but at night she would separate the upper part of her torso from her lower part, and her intestines would dangle down, and she spread her wings from her back, and she would fly around drinking human blood.
Ew.
Yeah, it's pretty
That is
disgusting.
Nasty.
They appear in a whole bunch of low-budget horror films from that part of the world. It's pretty bizarre. But they're not the most bizarre vampires, really.
Really?
Well, I think that qualifies as the Jiangshi, the hopping vampires of China.
Hopping vampires.
You're not familiar with hopping vampires?
No.
All right. A long time ago, before you were born, Hong Kong action movies became really popular. And I used to hang out at like video stores in Chinatown, getting VHS dubs of all the stuff that was coming out in Hong Kong. And there's a whole bunch of hopping vampire movies. That's an entire genre in Hong Kong. Most of them starred Lam Ching Ling as the magic
vampire.
priest. He's a magic priest who fights them. He's a Taoist priest. He played a Taoist priest so many times. In real life, he was actually a Buddhist.
Oh, wow.
But he popularized, like, a commonplace everyday Taoism to a lot of people. He was a martial artist and a magician. He's a very cool action hero. Now, the hopping dead, this is how it works. Now, in China, it's believed that your body should always be buried in, like, your family crypt or your hometown where you came from. And if you died away from your town or were buried somewhere else that was bad, that would lead to your spirit coming back and doing evil. So they would hire priests to go to the town wherever he'd been buried and then bring them back again with his powers. Now, you write Taoist spells on strips of yellow paper, and then you attach it to the foreheads of bodies who've recently resurrected. And that gives you control over them, of course.
Yeah.
However, being dead, rigor mortis is set in. And plus, because they're filled with yin, which is the dark part of the energy that fills all things, they're repelled by the yang of the earth, which means they can't stay in contact with the earth for very long. So they bounce up in the air.
Has this actually happened before? Or is it
Well,
just
it's a
like
part of Chinese folklore. There have been these stories about the Jiangshi that go back a long way.
Oh my God.
But the Hong Kong action movies brought these hopping vampires to like every parts of the earth, so now they become relatively commonplace. Yeah, they bounce along sort of like really deadly balloons.
Exploding.
Well, being like, a Chinese, action movie, they also have, because rigor mortis makes their limbs really stiff, so their arms stick out in front. But despite that, they're masters of a form of martial arts that involves the stiffness of the limbs, so they can still beat a kung fu expert 9 times out of 10.
Do you know why it's a yellow strip?
They cast spells of writing them on paper.
Okay, so
in
yellow is
Taoism.
like
Yeah.
the color for that. Okay.
And you attach it to the forehead to control the vampire. Well, it just starts out as a reanimated corpse.
Okay.
But inevitably, something would happen, like a windstorm would come along, or, a foolish student would not mix the paste properly that stuck the yellow paper in place, and it would fall off.
Okay.
Usually at a melodramatic moment in the script. And then it would stop being just a reanimated corpse and become a full-fledged vampire. And would start chasing people down with his razor-sharp fingernails to kill them.
Wow.
They were almost invulnerable. You could set fire to them, but they would probably kill you while they were burning, because they were that kind of enemy.
Yeah.
They couldn't talk. They weren't sexy vampires. They were just unstoppably dangerous. But they're also kind of silly.
Okay.
So a lot of the hopping vampire movies are pure comedies.
I can imagine that.
Yeah. On the other hand, in Hong Kong action movies, a comedy action movie is still one in which people die horribly all the time. So you have the Jiangshi, the hopping vampires. Every part of the world had their own vampire myth. It was all over Europe. Most of the vampires that we know today, that part of the vampire myth got its start in Eastern Europe. You had the Strigoi, which are from like Romania, and you had the Verlacos, which were from Greece. So everybody in Europe had heard these stories about things that come back from the grave and drink human blood. That was common folklore. So when Spanish explorers in 1526 ran across a small animal that literally drank blood, they immediately associated that with the myths they'd heard back in Europe.
Wow.
So they brought back the idea of an animal that drinks blood, and they attached that name, vampire, to the undead creatures from their own folklore. Now, in real life, vampires are not much of a menace.
No.
unless they happen to have rabies, because any animal with rabies is a menace. But real vampires are actually small. They're not these like huge bats like they're constantly shown in movies. They're small. They fly up mostly to cattle, and they have tiny little teeth that make an incision, and they lick up the blood that wells the surface, and then fly away again after 2 or 3 mouthfuls of blood, and that's it.
Yeah, it's not as dramatic as everyone makes it
It's
sound.
not that dramatic, but somehow it terrified the Spanish, and they got attached to the folklore of the undead. But the person that drove that all home was Bram Stoker.
Okay.
But Bram Stoker wasn't the first person to popularize the vampire. Vampires have always been popular. The stories have been around for a long time. So several writers before him were using vampires as a literary device.
Mm-hmm.
The famous one before Dracula, which my library owns a copy of, is The Vampire by John Polidori. Now it turns out that Polidori was a friend of Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, and he was with them at that famous weekend in the Villa della Dora in Switzerland.
Yeah.
When the weather was really lousy, so they all stayed inside telling each other ghost stories. Since you had some of the sharpest minds and the finest writers in the world in this one house, out of that one night, Dr. Polidori, who was there, wrote The Vampire. And several years later, Mary Shelley would write Frankenstein.
Wow.
After that one night of inspiration. Polidori was very close to Lord Byron, and some say that the vampire in this one, Lord Ruthven, is very much like a vampire version of Lord Byron. He was the first vampire who was suave and sexy. He would seduce women. He wasn't technically a blood drinker.
Okay.
We never saw him doing anything. He was probably more what we would call an energy vampire.
Mm-hmm.
He would date women, they would get listless and lifeless and that kind of thing and lose their spark. It's narrated in the first person by a guy who becomes a friend of Ruthven. And then when the brother of one of his victims attacks him and shoots him and apparently kills him dead with his dying breath, he says, leave my body out where the full moon can fall on it. So the guy's like, okay. So he does that the next night of the full moon, and sure enough, Ruthven pops back to life again because he's only a little dead.
Only a little bit.
Yeah. So that was the first really super popular vampire story. And not long after that, a book came out called Carmilla, which I don't have a copy of here. Carmilla was the first one about a female vampire. It was also the first one that had subtle lesbian overtones. And I say subtle because this was still like the mid-1800s.
Yeah.
So nothing really happens in the book. A family finds a woman who's been injured in a carriage accident and takes her back to nurse her back to health. And although she gets stronger, the guy's daughter starts to get weaker.
Wow.
And so everything is subtle and implied in Carmilla, which didn't stop the idea of sexy female vampires and lesbian vampires from becoming a thing in pop culture. And also, in the 1800s, you had a character known as Varney the Vampire. In those days, they had something called penny dreadfuls.
Okay. What's
They
that?
were really cheaply printed, like newspaper-style things that had stories in them. And they had serial stories. They would come out once a week. It would have a chapter of this really super long book. And there was a whole series of stories about Varney the Vampire, who was an aristocrat who fed off the blood of the lower classes. And his story went on for several years, a different chapter like every week, probably by 2 or 3 different writers. It's still in print. It became kind of famous.
Yeah.
But I tried to read it, and it's really awful.
Is it really?
It's not very good, but it was hugely popular at the time. And this lodged in people's minds, the idea of vampires.
Yeah.
And so vampires were an idea that was on everybody's mind at the time. It just took one person to make lightning strike, and that person was Bram Stoker in Dracula. Dracula's in public domain, so anybody can get a copy of it. It's free on Project Gutenberg.
Yeah.
When I chose the copy from my library, I picked the one illustrated by Edward Gorey. So it's got really great black and white illustrations that look like woodcuts. Very cool. Now, interestingly, he based Dracula on Vlad the Impaler, who was a very real person. He ruled parts of Romania and the area that became known as Transylvania for a while until like World War I gobbled it up. And the humorous part about this is, although Stoker did some research for this, he didn't do a lot of research. I think he had the idea for a vampire story in mind, so he attached his vampire character to the stories he heard about Vlad the Impaler, because Vlad was a very ruthless autocratic ruler.
Yeah.
He's called Vlad the Impaler because he impaled people on giant wooden spikes, and they died slowly and horribly.
Very torturous.
Oh yeah, yeah. He would do things like when Turks visited his court, he refused to take off their hats because they wore turbans. So he had the turbans nailed to their heads; they wouldn't have to take them off from then on. Oh yeah. He was really a nice guy. He did keep the area from being conquered by the Turks,
Yeah.
so they weren't taken over by the Muslims, which was a very big thing at the time. So he's considered a great hero to his people, but a horrible monster to pretty much everybody else. Now, the only story that's not told about him is that he was a vampire.
Was he
No.
Oh,
At the
okay.
time, no one thought of that. He was
Okay.
just a monstrous, evil person.
Yeah.
So it took Bram Stoker many years after Vlad's death. Vlad Tepes was his actual name. Many years after his death, to attach the idea of being a vampire to him. If you're a fan of vampires and you haven't read Dracula, I highly recommend it.
I have when I was like, I don't know, like the little kid versions, you know?
Yeah.
Never like the original.
The full version is worth reading.
Yeah.
It's really good. It's different from every movie version you've seen. No movie version seems able to capture exactly the way Stoker approached it. He lived in a very different world. It was Victorian England, you know. Dracula, you first see him as an old man taking care of Jonathan Harker, who's come there to sell him property in England. Harker was a solicitor, and Harker is horrified and appalled by everything that happens to him at Castle Dracula, including being fed to his 3 really attractive brides at one point.
Oh, wow.
And Dracula presents himself as a very, the autocratic ruler you would expect him to be.
Mm-hmm.
Very like high-class nobility, but he's foreign nobility, which makes him a barbarian to British eyes. And actually, he is kind of barbaric. But he sees a picture of Mina, Harker's fiance, that Harker carries with them. And apparently, Dracula decides, I think I'll cross half the world, go to England, and kill her, or make her one of my brides. So he does.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that motivation is so flimsy. Most movies have it like, Mina is the reincarnation of his lost love. Like, no, in the original book, he just goes there to flat out kill her. Or enslave her. We don't know what his motives are. One of the funny things about Dracula is it's an epistolatory novel. Are you familiar with those?
No.
Epistolatory novel is a story that's told entirely in letters. People have done modern ones that are done in emails or tweets.
Uh-huh.
Basically, the story is told from the different people who are in the story, write letters to people, describe what's happening to them.
Okay.
So we get to hear Jonathan Harker's version of what happens, his wife Mina's version of what happens. Dr. Seward, who runs the sanitarium, you see his version of what happens. Everything is seen through the eyes of all these different people, except Dracula.
Mm-hmm.
Dracula doesn't keep a diary. So
you never see
we
what's-
never really know his motivations. We think you can guess his motivations sometimes, but we really don't know.
Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, he's a cipher.
Okay.
He's a mysterious force that arrives and kills people and does things, and then a whacked out professor, Van Helsing, with a really stereotyped like Dutch accent shows up. He
Yeah.
sounds like a comic relief character. Who knows all about vampires and it tells them how to defeat Dracula and so forth. Like weirdly, Van Helsing is quite obviously Jewish in the book,
This.
but he has them using like a cross and consecrated holy wafers against Dracula. Because I'm sure, as an observant Jew, he would
Yeah.
know all about how that worked. Yeah, I don't know. It's Bram Stoker. And people have gone through Dracula with a fine-tooth comb. Someone says it represents the threat of like foreigners arriving in England, the threat of minorities arriving in your country,
Yeah.
the same kind of thing we still have going on to this day. There's a theory that Dracula symbolizes the Black Death, because pandemics were still a thing in the 1890s as well as today.
Yeah,
That
definitely.
he comes in like a plague vector, basically, and people just start dropping dead, and no one knows why. In fact, it's a new blood disease that Van Helsing is called upon to investigate. Of course, he sees through that right away. Also, Dracula's like mesmerizing power over women and men.
Men too. Wow.
Yeah, he could hypnotize anyone, and that was seen as being like a subtle thing. because Bram Stoker worked as a theatrical manager for Henry Irving, who was the premier Shakespearean actor of his time. And Henry Irving was a tall, dark, extremely handsome fellow with great cheekbones, who had this magnetic gaze that could rivet an audience to him. The kind of guy who would take command of a room just by walking into it.
Wow.
In every description, he sounds exactly like Dracula. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Bram Stoker wanted Dracula to be produced as a play by the company that he worked for, but for whatever reason, it never happened.
Wow. Why do you think so?
I don't know. For one thing, bootleg versions of it appeared almost instantly.
Okay.
Henry Irving might have decided not to try to compete with the bootlegs that were already on stage in London.
Mm-hmm.
And Stoker, when he was alive, and his widow after he died, was suing people right and left. The first movie version of Dracula was called Nosferatu,
Mm-hmm.
and that featured the big guy with bald with the huge ears and everything like that. And he deliberately had makeup on to not look like Dracula from the book. But the plot is exactly like Dracula from the book.
Yeah.
So Stoker's widow still sued and won, and then pulled Nosferatu from distribution for a long time.
Wow.
It's a trademark lawsuit about several hundred years dead now, but still, it actually happened. So, Dracula was huge, and it was extremely popular.
Yeah.
There are suddenly vampires everywhere. Before we move on, do you know that one of the most famous vampires in the world, it comes from right here in Rhode Island?
Yeah, I forgot her name, but
Mercy Brown.
Yeah,
Mercy Brown
I
in
visited
Exeter.
her grave for my school one day.
That's great, so long as you didn't vandalize it.
No, I didn't. Never.
Annoying teens go to her grave all the time to vandalize it. It's awful.
I think it's cool.
She was in 1892. She was one of the earliest vampires in America, possibly the first vampire in America.
Which is really cool because it was here.
Yeah, she suffered from tuberculosis apparently in real life. And tuberculosis, see if this sounds familiar, it makes you really thin, you lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
you get incredibly pale, and you start coughing up blood. So here she is, she's really thin with pale, luminous skin, and she has blood on her lips because she's constantly coughing up her own lungs.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you're gonna
So when
get
she, so when she died, they took it for granted that she was a vampire. Because after she died, members of her family kept dying too, because they had tuberculosis because it was contagious.
Yeah.
And so eventually, when her brother was getting deathly ill, they dug up her grave and cut out her heart and burned it. And they mixed it into a medicine which they fed to her brother, who, not surprisingly, died anyway.
Yeah. I think that would have made it worse.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
It did not help at all. But the one thing all these vampires have in common is that they're all villains. They're all monsters. However, they're also kind of cool.
Definitely.
People have always liked vampires right from the very beginning.
They have something different about them.
Well, yeah, it's like, they're hip, they're sexy, they're undead,
They're undead.
I mean, yeah, particularly if you're like a teenager, if you're, a vampire is as strong as 10 men, so he's never fading and beaten up by bullies. He can hypnotize any woman he wants to do his will. Well, that's really useful, in a horrible way, but yeah, who hasn't fantasized about that? Yeah, sure, you have to drink blood, but honestly, in this day and age, that's nothing.
Yeah.
I know people who drink human blood who aren't even real vampires. They just do it,
Mm-hmm.
But it took decades before anyone came along and realized, hey, I can make a cool vampire character. Do you know who the first sympathetic vampire was?
No, who?
It was Barnabas Collins in Dark Shadows.
Okay, I had a conversation with this really recently. Isn't it played by Johnny Depp or something like that?
No, the original was Jonathan
The
Frakes.
original, okay.
They did a remake with Johnny Depp that was awful.
Yeah, it was
The
very
remake
bad.
was horrible.
Yeah.
Do not see the remake of it.
Because I watched the movie and I thought it was decent, but then I watched the show after.
Yeah.
And then no.
Yes, Dark Shadows was a soap opera.
Yes.
It was an occult soap opera. It started out just as sort of a gothic romance, where there were mysterious things going on, but you never knew what.
Mm-hmm.
And the ratings weren't that good, so the director and the producer finally decided, we'll throw in a real monster. And so all of a sudden, Jonathan Frakes shows up as Barnabas Collins, cursed to become a vampire by an evil witch, and he's been chained in a coffin since the colonial times.
Mm-hmm.
It comes back and drinks human blood, and Jonathan Frakes was considered very sexy in his day. He was a sex symbol, yeah, in the 60s.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
I don't see it.
Well, he was, and he was the first sympathetic vampire.
Okay.
He had a conscience. He didn't want to be a vampire. He had to drink human blood. There's no other way for him to survive. And it was about his eternal struggle to, try to still be a good human being and drink blood at the same time. Sometimes he won the fight against his vampire nature, sometimes he lost. The big problem with going back and watching Dark Shadows is it was a soap opera that was on every day. There are hundreds of episodes, and he doesn't even appear until like just after the 100th or so episode.
Wow, it was every day.
Yeah, it was on every afternoon. I used to come home from school and watch it as a kid.
And weren't they like shot like live too?
It was pretty much shot live.
Yeah.
It was shot very cheaply because, they had very bad videotape in those days. I remember watching some of the old ones, and there's a character carrying a candelabra across the screen, and you can see a black line because the flames of the candles were so bright. They burned a hole in the video, basically. So she left a line across the screen for a split second.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, they worked with the tools that they had.
Yeah.
It was enormously successful for a while. Eventually it burned out like all things did. But that definitely planted in people's minds the idea that vampires could be cool. But that was the 60s. It still took several more years before Anne Rice would hit Vampire Gold with Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah, we talked about this in the
We
first
talked about this in that first one. Now, ironically, Interview with the Vampire came out the very same year that Stephen King wrote Salem's Lot. And Salem's Lot was a deliberate throwback to the really old monstrous vampires. Barlow of Salem's Lot is not sympathetic or sexy in any way. He's just a monster that kills people. And although both of them were popular, Salem's Lot was also a bestseller, but in the long run, it would be Anne Rice who defined vampires for the next several years and the coming millennium.
Yeah.
Do you have any closing comments?
I don't know. I feel like it changed so much because back, like as you could tell, back then they were more just like, I'm gonna kill you, drink your blood. And now it's more like, you'll do whatever I want,
Yeah, like that power fantasy.
Yeah.
Vampires are all about that.
If you take like Dracula or like Barnabas kind of, and then you put him next to like a modern vampire like Edward Collins or like someone from like Vampire Diaries, two different people. Two different.
Yeah.
So.
When they did the very popular Buffy the Vampire series, most of the vampires that she fought were basically mindless killing machines.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But they also knew how popular vampires were. People are going to want to see a hot vampire that they can like. So they created Angel, the vampire with a soul, who was the good vampire on the series. He was spun off into his own series, but the most popular vampire to come out was, of course, Spike. So even though he technically didn't have a soul and technically was a monster, people still liked him.
They really don't care about the soul or no soul.
Yeah, soul or no soul, it doesn't matter. He was hot. He had that great leather trench coat, too. I loved that.
I loved that show. So.
Yeah. All right, so moving on, we actually did talk about some books this time.
We did. First time
I
ever.
have 2 Dark Shadows books in my collection, but they're both checked out right now. So I had to get the video disc. So we'll be back next time with another episode of Book Talking. I have been Ed.
And I'm andGabby.
And we'll see you next time. Thank you and be safe.
Bye.